An angel then speaks to John. Now, the Greek actually just says, and he said to me. Newer translations will incorporate the word angel, given what happens when John tries to bow down to this being. But either way, whether we just take, and he said to me, or the angel said to me, it's hard to tell where this has come from. Because up to this point, there hasn't been, in chapter 19, an angel speaking to John. So is this one of the angels from chapter 18? Okay, he's interacted with several angels. In chapter 17, one of the angels that had one of the 7 bowls of wrath talks to John. So there are angels all over this place. And so we can't say, oh, this one is the one that was also. But here again, what John has been doing is been seeing, he's been hearing, and then every so often an angel has been speaking to him to point him to something specific. Right? And so chapter 17, come see the judgment of the great prostitute. So what we're seeing here is there's something specific that John is meant to know. Especially, there is something specific that John is meant to write. Now, there have been a couple of times throughout Revelation, John's been told to write. From the very beginning of chapter 1, write to the angels of the church. And of course, we know that in chapter 10, he's prohibited from writing what the 7 thunders said. But at different times, it's been emphasized, write this, because there's something specific. Okay? And so John's been copying down what he's been seeing and hearing, but now there's something specific to be emphasized. Write this down. Specifically, he is to write down, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. The fourth of the 7 blessing statements in Revelation. Who are those invited to the marriage of the Lamb who are going to be blessed here? Okay, so the saints. Right? The saints are the ones invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Who's the Lamb getting married to? The church, which is made up of the saints. So the saints are both the guest and the bride. Okay? Wait, how does that work? Right? Again, apocalyptic. Right? The point is that God is calling people to the wedding of the Lamb. Specifically, he's calling people to be involved in the wedding of the Lamb, not as spectators, but as participants.
Well, I say individually the saints are invited as guests, but as a collective whole, they're invited.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it, is that, there's this, depending on which way you look at it, right? You look at it the collective side, or you look at it the individualistic side. And so participants and spectators, or invitees. Now, of course, thinking back to the wedding parable in Matthew 22, those invited were the ones that refused to come. So there still here is this, God is extending this invitation. So, accept it. Accept the invitation. Accept your place in the marriage supper of the Lamb. And really, when we look back through Jewish history, and even through the Gospels, there is what we might call the Messianic banquet. This idea of, at the end of time, God is going to have a huge banquet party. Communion. Jesus talks about, I won't drink this again until it is new with you in my Father's kingdom. He talks about many will come from the east and west and sit at the table and eat with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, while the heirs of the kingdom will be left outside. Right? And the Jews were going to miss their opportunity to be at the Messianic banquet. Even in passages like Isaiah 25:6, On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. Right? God creating a banquet, creating a supper for people as a reward for their obedience, their service. The angel continues by saying, these are the true words of God. Now, first of all, it's an angel talking to him. So wouldn't you expect that the words are true? Right? But just so you don't miss it, these are the true words of God. These are sure, they are truthful. The people invited to the wedding supper, the marriage supper, are blessed. Those are the ones God blessed. I just realized I have a misspelling in the next sentence. Should be, I fell down. I guess if you had a really bad accent, I fell down at his feet to worship him. But that should be, I fell down, because John is overwhelmed, so he's feeling, right? This is what must have been going on in my mind. He's feeling, I don't think that's going to anybody find that, right? So he falls down to worship the angel. So just like we saw the 24 elders, overwhelmed by God's power, majesty, what he has done, John too is overwhelmed by this. But what's the reaction of the angel when John prepares to worship him? Yeah, he warns him against doing it. So while we might understand John's response, in the presence of this angel, it's not appropriate. And so John is not to do this. The angel does not deserve nor want John's worship because of who the angel is. Angels are fellow servants. And so the reason the angel is not a proper subject for worship is it too is a servant, just like John is, just like other Christians are. And so no more worthy of worship than anyone else. Instead, who does the angel encourage John to worship? The proper response is to worship God out of this. The angel is simply what his name means, messenger, delivering the message. The source of this is God. These are the true words of God, not the true words of the angel. Which, if we understand this as a general principle, the only one deserving of worship is God, when we look at a passage like Matthew 28, verse 17, where Jesus is preparing to give the 11 the Great Commission, Matthew writes, when they saw him, meaning Jesus, they worshipped him. If Jesus was God, if Jesus was not God, he should not have allowed that worship. But there's something there that Matthew is claiming about who Jesus is, that the apostles, the 11, are recognizing about Jesus' character. So worship God. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Okay, how do we understand this? Because as we look at it, the testimony of Jesus is a spirit of prophecy. Now these ofs can function in a couple of different ways. What are some options about what the phrase, the testimony of Jesus, might mean? Okay, I'm thinking more not so much the content of it, but more simplistic or a simpler way of thinking about this. Right. So the testimony of Jesus could mean Jesus' testimony, right? The testimony Jesus gave. What else could it mean? the testimony about Jesus, right? And so we could say about instead of. So first it could be Jesus' testimony is the spirit of prophecy, or it could be the testimony about Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. You might even be able to argue that it could be both, right? That the testimony Jesus gave is the testimony about Jesus. That's going to be even more confusing. But also, when we go to this, the spirit of prophecy, we have some difficulty as well, because we kind of run into the same kind of thing. The spirit of prophecy, the spirit, the spirit that prophecy has, or the prophetic spirit, might be another way to think about that. And of course, we haven't even gotten to the point of, should this be a lowercase s or a capital S? And is the Holy Spirit in view here? Because guess what? In the Greek, it's the same word. Right? And it's all in capital letters. So you don't know is it capital S, lowercase s. So you might have one or the other in your translation, but then also a footnote that might capitalize or lowercase it, depending on which way. So the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Now, is it meant to say here kind of the essence of prophecy, right? If we think lowercase s, the spirit of prophecy is that, like, the essence of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. Or the testimony of Jesus is inspired by the prophetic spirit. So either of those, I think, would kind of fit into it. But ultimately, what's being emphasized here is the testimony of Jesus in the context of the message about Jesus. Now, that message about Jesus includes what Jesus claimed about himself. But I think overall, it's the testimony about Jesus that's in view here. And so the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. John experiences another vision as the heaven opened. Now, in chapter 4, John sees a door in heaven open. And so he ascends into this door, and we remember chapter 4, chapter 5, this great experience of God's throne room. I almost get, like, the image that comes to my mind is like God, it's like John standing on earth, and the heavens just kind of parting, or the sky is kind of parting. Not a door, but just kind of this huge expanse. Because what's getting ready to come through here is an army. So this isn't a door. It's kind of like the gates being pulled back, and here comes the army. And the first thing that John notes is a white horse. That's what draws his attention immediately. Now, we've seen throughout the book of Revelation that white is usually connected with ideas of purity, holiness, righteousness. There might be some to that, given who's on this horse. But what else might white be representing here on this horse?
Why was the war horses back then?
Yeah, it's the idea of the war horse, especially the conquering war horse, right? You know, this is what, of course, because the rider is going to be a king. Right? So at the front of the armies here, heaven's armies, is a rider on a white horse. Now, we talked a little bit about this back in chapter 6 when we saw the 7 seals opening. I think this is a different rider than the rider on the white horse of the first seal. But whether that's the case or not, we're definitely assured of this rider, who this rider is. And so John gives some characteristics of this rider on the white horse. His name, or he is called Faithful and True. Now, by saying he's called this, what's this supposed to tell us about the characteristics of what does being faithful mean? All right, so loyal, steadfast, particularly, of course, loyal to God and God's purposes, but also loyal to His people, the truth, honesty, right? So this is someone that you can have confidence in. There's no lie here. They're loyal. They are faith. The writer is faithful and true. Furthermore, in righteousness, he judges and makes war. Now, some of you, I thought maybe something was off on the screen, which would possibly happen. In righteousness, he judges and makes war. And so there's connections here to expressions about God throughout the book, about His righteousness, His judgment, making war. When He goes to war, it's righteous. How He acts in war is righteous. And out of this description of this writer and some other passages in Scripture, that later Christians would develop what became known as the just war tradition and just war theology, about when is it appropriate to go to war? What are the causes that someone should go to war about justly? How do you act justly in war? But the war that this writer is preparing to enact is not necessarily the same kind of war. Right? It's a war that doesn't really involve any significant battle, but it is a war in which he is victorious. His eyes are like a flame of fire. We've talked about this image before, right? The fierceness of judgment. He's coming to judge Babylon. And so this ferocity here. On his head are many diadems. Now we've mentioned several times, haven't had cause to do it in the past couple of weeks, but especially at the beginning we talked about the distinction between the Stephanos crown, the crown of victory, like the laurel crown, versus the diadem, the crown of royalty, of ruling. But by saying that on his head are many diadems, why would you wear more than one crown? Right. So what's being suggested here is he's a king over more than one kingdom, right? Or that his kingdom involves the conquering of many nations. And so by saying he's got many diadems, he's ruling over multiple nations. And we'll see that when we see that he's called King of Kings and Lord of Lords.